네, 안녕하십니까. 영국의 기후변화 대응 성과와
Hello, everyone. We will be starting the webinar on Korea's Carbon Neutrality Committee. We will be discussing about the UK's achievement in responding to climate change and the Korea's path towards carbon neutrality. Today's seminar has been hosted by the Energy Transition Forum of Korea, also Office of the Congressman Mr. Kim Sunghwan, also Congresswomen Yangyi, Wonyoung, and Congresswoman Lee Soyoung. So first, I would like to invite Mr. Hong, the co-representative of the forum, for his opening remarks. Hello, nice to meet you. I'm Jong Hong. I can see some of you joining us offline, and I understand that many of us are joining us online. As you know, we are going through a very critical moment in history. How can we mitigate the climate change? And what we do now will actually determine the fate of our future. Therefore, I would like to stress that it is a critical moment, and it's only timely for us to learn from the precedents of the UK and how they are putting the governance in place to make sure that climate change is properly and more proactively mitigated and further reduced. I believe that Korea also needs to step up its effort to do a pan-governmental committee to make sure that we have the right legal framework as well as the basic acts to make sure that we can strengthen our efforts towards climate change. So thank you for your participation. And I would also like to thank two of our participants from the UK for taking part in today's seminar and also for the other congresspersons that will be delivering their remarks. Thank you.
오늘 자리에는 참석해 주신
And we would like to move on to Congressman Sunghwan Kim's congratulatory remarks.
Good afternoon. I am Kim Sunghwan, Executive Chair of the Committee on Carbon Neutrality of the Minju Party. As you all know, one of the most pressing issues in the world is the climate change. And in order to tackle this issue, all nations around the world declare that they will go carbon neutral by 2050 at the latest. There are many tasks ahead, are the closure of coal power plants, converting internal combustion cars to electric cars, and transforming energy-intensive industries such as steel, cement, and petrochemical industries. So there are so many tasks that we have to pursue and that require the transformation of the civilization itself. Korea is emitting 730 million tons of CO2 per year, and resolving this issue is one of the most critical tasks for us. To resolve this, Korea has the Basic Act on Carbon Neutrality proposed to the National Assembly for voting this year. And the UK has enacted such a bill already 10 years ago and implementing this as a model nation. And we will benchmark the US case to accomplish the carbon neutrality in Korea as soon as possible as a responsible member of the global society. I sincerely hope that all 7 billion citizens of the Earth would protect our planet together, and Korea will follow the great leadership of the UK in that regard. And I will do my best at the National Assembly to support that effort. Congratulations. Now we will go on to other great distinguished guests. And we have Congresswoman Yangyi Wonyoung. She couldn't be here in person, but she's joining us online. Nice to meet you. So I am Yangyi Wonyoung, and I am trying to be a warm National Assembly woman. And actually, I am currently under quarantine, so I couldn't be there in person, but joining you through Zoom. The climate change actions of the UK is world famous. In 2008, you enacted the Climate Change Act, and the process of that enactment showed great example for the world, we had the public participation and public support for that process in the UK. And after that, in expanding the renewable energy, the UK government has put the utmost efforts. The offshore wind is about 10 gigawatts in capacity currently. So when I saw some PowerPoints from the UK speakers here, I was so envious. It said that by 2035, you will cut the carbon emission by 78%. Well, you are in a smooth road to accomplish carbon neutrality by 2050. Well, I'm so envious because Korea is just beginning our discussion now. Our 2030 target, well, we said that we will increase the target, but no details are confirmed. I believe that we have to stop coal power plants, but at the same time, we can provide some support for those coal power plants that will stop the operation and also provide some support for those who would lose their jobs because of that. Well, when we have more discussions, detailed discussions about that, then I think that we can catch up with what the UK has done to accomplish the 2050 carbon neutrality goal in Korea. So today, there will be discussions and presentations about great examples of the UK, and we will learn from that so that many people of Korea, including myself, can take note and apply that in the Korean situation. So I will close my remarks here. Thank you.
네, 양현영 의원님 감사합니다.
Thank you for your remarks. Next, we were planning to have Congresswoman Soyoung Lee, but she's on her way to the very venue, but she's being a little bit late. So we'll go on to our next speaker is the Honorable Ambassador to Korea.
I'm delighted to be able to address the Carbon Neutrality Committee at such a critical time. In addition to acknowledging our distinguished Korean speakers this morning, I also want to extend my thanks to Dr. Rebecca Heaton from the UK's Climate Change Committee and Dr. Alina Averchenkova from the London School of Economics for joining us today. As we look towards the UN Climate Change Conference, otherwise known as COP26 in Glasgow later this year, I welcome President Moon's commitments to both domestic and international climate action. I'm encouraged that Korea is working to join the UK and others in legislating for net zero emissions by 2050, and I strongly welcome the establishment of the Carbon Neutrality Committee to guide Korea's pathway to net zero. The UK's Climate Change Committee has played a pivotal role in our own climate journey. Since its establishment through the UK's 2008 Climate Change Act, the committee has advised and overseen the UK's action on emissions reduction. The committee advises the UK on setting interim emissions targets, assesses annually the UK's progress in reducing emissions, and reports directly and transparently to Parliament. Its independent and expert composition sees it play a hugely influential role in guiding national climate policy, a role it maintains even in the event of a change of government. I hope that Korea's Carbon Neutrality Committee will play a similar role in ensuring Korea's interim emission reduction targets are in line with the science and consistent with the trajectories needed to achieve the Paris Agreement, limiting temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius and as close to 1.5 degrees Celsius as possible. As leading global economies, the UK and Korea must also lead the way on decisive action to mitigate the effects of climate change. And I hope that Korea's Carbon Neutrality Committee and the UK's Climate Change Committee will be able to work together closely on this global imperative, and in doing so, help protect our planet for future generations. Thank you.
네, 사이언 스미스 주한영국 대사님 감사합니다. 그럼 본격적으로
Thank you for your remarks, Ambassador. Now we will start with the webinar. The moderator for today is the co-representative of the Energy Transition Forum of Korea, Professor Jong.
We have the finish time for the forum already confirmed, so we will just proceed with the presentation. We have two presenters for today. They are joining us online. So the two presenters have other schedules at Korean time of 5 p.m. So they will each have 15 minutes for their presentation and will be here with us until 5 p.m. Korean time to answer any questions. And then we will go into the panel discussion after that. So we will go on to the first presentation. The topic is 10 years of the Climate Change Act, and we have Dr. Alina Averchenkova from Grantham Institute of London School of Economics. So you can have 15 minutes, Doctor.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, distinguished delegates and guests. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share the experiences with adoption and implementation of climate change legislation in the UK. Could I just check that you can see my slides? Can you see my slides? Yes. So at the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics, we have been tracking climate change related laws and policies around the world for the past 6 years. And if we look at 1997, which is the year when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, there were only about 70 climate and climate related laws and policies around the world. As of today, in 2020, last year, we count over 2,000 such laws and policies. There is no country in the world which hasn't implemented some sort of law or policy on climate change. However, what is important that not all policies and laws are created equal. There is a very important type of climate legislation, which we call framework climate change laws. These are laws which establish overall direction, strategic direction for climate change policy for the country. They often contain emission reduction target and also set up key institutional infrastructure for addressing climate change. And there are about 40 such strategic framework legislations around the world. On this slide, you can see examples of some of them. However, the first comprehensive framework climate change law was the UK Climate Change Act, the one that we will be discussing in this session. Adopted in 2008, UK Climate Change Act was the first international, at the global level, it was the first legislation in the world which established binding emission reduction targets at the national level, and also over long term, but also created ways to intermediate steps for carbon budgets of getting to that long-term emission reduction target for 2050. Following the example of the UK, many other countries have adopted similar comprehensive climate change laws. In 2012, for example, Mexico was the first emerging economy to pass such a comprehensive climate change legislation. And more recently, we have seen a number of countries legislating also net zero targets, such as Norway, Sweden, and Europe, France, and many other countries. So in the next 10 minutes, I will talk more in more detail about the UK Climate Change Act and also about our assessment of how effective has this legislation been, what difference has it made for the UK climate change policy. So firstly, briefly, let's look at the key components of the UK Climate Change Act. First of all, in 2008, the Climate Change Act has established a long-term emission reduction target, which initially was reducing overall emissions of greenhouse gases in the UK by at least 80% below the level of 1990 by 2050, covering the whole economy and all greenhouse gases. However, in 2019, following the adoption of the Paris Agreement, following the new scientific evidence, the UK government has taken a decision following the advice by the independent expert advisory body, the Committee on Climate Change, to increase that level of ambition to net zero target by 2050. That target has been very important, as I will talk a little bit more in detail later, in establishing long-term direction of travel for the UK climate change policy and for decarbonization of the UK economy. And it has defined UK's international contribution to addressing climate change problem. However, the Climate Change Act doesn't stop there. It also establishes a mechanism called carbon budgets, which is a sequence of 5-year targets, intermediate targets, that allow the UK step by step to get to the 2050 emission reduction target. So you can see on this slide, carbon budgets basically represent progressive emission reductions. They are set out 12 years ahead of the start of each emission reduction period. It's very important that 12 years warning is given both to the government agencies, but most importantly to businesses, to economic agents, to prepare to the emission reductions they will need to take. The target is, the level of the target for each carbon budget is recommended by the Independent Committee on Climate Change, which Rebecca will talk about in more detail in a minute. And then they are considered by the government and put forward for the UK Parliament for approval. In addition to these key pillars of mitigation policy, the Climate Change Act has also laid the ground for adaptation planning in the UK. The legislation requires 5-year cycles of adaptation programming, which consist of assessments of climate change risk in the UK, which need to be published and updated every 5 years, followed by then publication of adaptation policy by the government. And very importantly, our research has found that having these provisions in the UK Climate Change Act has really put adaptation planning on the map of private sector and also the government. The fourth important element, a crucial element of the UK Climate Change Act was an innovation which was picked up later by many countries around the world, is the establishment of independent advisory body, the UK Committee on Climate Change. And this is the prototype, serves as a prototype for many advisory bodies, including Carbon Neutrality Committee that you're discussing today. The Climate Change Committee is an independent body comprised of highly distinguished, experienced, independent experts supported by Secretariat. Their mission is to advise on the level of carbon targets, comment and provide independent assessment of policies that the government is putting forward to implement the target, and also to monitor independently progress in implementation of climate change legislation and in achievement of emission reductions. And finally, in addition to those key elements, the Climate Change Act establishes very clear responsibilities for the UK government and also establishes accountability in front of the Parliament for implementation of climate legislation. The government is obliged to provide clear plans for how to meet carbon targets and also to report annually to the UK Parliament on progress in implementation of legislation. Now, in 2018, at the Grantham Research Institute, we have set out to determine what was the impact of this legislation on the UK climate change policy. And to do that, we have conducted over 30 interviews with senior policy experts, business leaders, politicians. And I will highlight some of the key messages that research has shown. Well, first of all, the impact on emissions. It's quite difficult to distinguish how much the legislation itself has contributed to emission reductions versus the policies which were adopted below or under that legislation. However, you can clearly see that since 1990, UK emissions have come down over 40%, by over 40%, while gross domestic product, the economy has grown by about 80%. So the intensity of carbon intensity of the UK economy has come down by at least a factor of 3. And discussing it with key experts, we have heard a very strong message that the Climate Change Act has played a key role in accelerating emission reductions after 2008. You can see it on the graph that the reductions are much steeper. In particular, it has played an important role in uptake of renewable energy. The second important impact of the Climate Change Act has been that the political debate on climate change in the UK has improved significantly. The legislation has created a routine where climate change is discussed at regular intervals. There are clear requirements for reporting and monitoring, and also the mechanism of carbon budgets has created a clear order for the UK government to organize its activities and policies on climate change. And the Committee on Climate Change, the Climate Change Committee, has been a key part in ensuring and delivering those results. We have found that CCC, the Climate Change Committee, provides independent and trusted evidence, which is picked up across all of the political parties, all of the political spectrum in the UK. More often, the committee is cited by opposition. However, all political parties and all actors, including private sector, rely on its information. In this slide, I wanted to show you some of the examples of how much influence the UK Climate Change Committee has had on the political debate. We have analyzed all of the texts of parliamentary speeches in the UK Parliament over the past 10 years. All of the speeches which mentioned climate change, we checked whether they relied on the information provided by Climate Change Committee. And what we found is that Committee on Climate Change is cited 5 times more than Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in Parliament. And what was also very interesting, the information produced by the committee is not only picked in the discussions on climate change, but it featured in the discussions on energy bill, energy policy, on infrastructure, on aviation, on water policy. As you can see in this graph, about half of all of the sittings in Parliament, which were focusing on energy, for example, they used information produced by the UK Climate Change Committee. Very briefly, we have looked at the experiences of other countries in establishing independent expert advisory bodies similar to the UK's Climate Change Committee. And what we have found is that there are key factors of success for such committees, which might be useful for you as you design the Carbon Neutrality Committee in the Republic of Korea. And those key factors are having very clear mandate for the body, identified ideally in the legislation itself, deciding and defining what they have to do and how does that fit in the climate policy cycle, providing clear mechanism for government to be accountable and to respond to the advice that the committee is providing. In the UK, the government can't just ignore the recommendations of the committee. If they don't follow them, they have to publicly respond and explain why they haven't followed the recommendations. The committee needs to have allocated predictable funding, high level of technical expertise, and sufficient degree of independence from the government. And very importantly, parliamentary oversight helps give it higher visibility and give it appropriate place in the climate policy. Another outcome of the UK climate change legislation is that it has helped to hold political consensus around the importance of climate policy. In the UK, there have been 5 governments, 4 general elections, and 3 political crises, including austerity, Brexit. However, what we have seen that the commitment to climate policy has held for all of this crisis and even resulted in greater emission reduction target of net zero in 2050, as I mentioned. And in our research, we have found that the climate change legislation has been central for helping to hold this political consensus and the commitment to climate policy. And here is the example of how the opinions of politicians might change over time, and they have changed in the UK, and this is an example of David Cameron. However, the country is still committed to the objectives of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and decarbonizing the economy. Not everything has come to perfectly to plan, and what our research has found is that on its own, the UK Climate Change Act, it's not sufficiently investable for private sector, because the specific policies to meet the carbon targets, they are designed by the government, and after each carbon budget is adopted. And through that, there might be insufficient protection against backsliding. In particular, I know Rebecca will talk more about that, so I will not spend too much time on this, but more ambitious emission reduction target of net zero to 2050 will require greater ambition in the future carbon budgets. And there is already analysis by the UK Climate Change Committee is that current policies will not be sufficient to meet the legislated 2030 ambition. So the UK will need to move from addressing emissions from easier sectors such as power to more difficult emission reductions in industry, residential, agriculture, and aviation. So I will conclude with the key learnings from all of the research we have conducted. What we can see is that a good framework law is definitely an effective way to orient, coordinate, and advance ambitious climate action. And independent advisory bodies such as UK Climate Change Committee, but also hopefully the Carbon Neutrality Committee that you're discussing in Korea at the moment, play a central role in informing policy-making process and in strengthening policy legitimacy and accountability of government and other actors for implementation. However, what is very important, the framework climate change legislation by itself is not a substitute for political leadership on climate change. There needs to be a sustained commitment from the government and other actors in the society. Thank you so much.
예, 아베첸코바 박사님 고맙습니다.
Thank you, Dr. Averchenkova. I believe there will be a lot of questions. We'll move on to our second speaker, Dr. Rebecca Heaton from the Climate Change Committee. And I believe that the CCC was mentioned a lot. So please, when you're ready, Dr. Heaton.
Hello. So I'm Rebecca Heaton and I'm a member of the UK Climate Change Committee. Thank you very much, Alina, for your excellent overview of it. I learnt quite a bit there about how we're thought about by the external world. But I'm going to talk a bit about what the committee does. First of all, a bit about the Climate Change Act, and then I'll talk about our net zero target. So I hope you can all see the slides. Right. So first of all, talking a little bit about what the Climate Change Committee's role is under the UK's Climate Change Act. So we have the Climate Change Act in the UK, and this was set up in 2008 or legislated in 2008. And it has 4 key elements to it. So first of all, it has a long-term goal. So where do we want to get to? And for in the UK, that's net zero by 2050. But then it has a pathway to get there. And this really focuses government a little bit on the shorter term and what's going on now, rather than thinking we can wait until 2050. And so for that, we set up something called carbon budgets. So that's the amount of greenhouse gases that the UK can emit in 5-year periods. Then we also have a toolkit, which is how is the government going to get there? And Alina talked about this. We don't set the policies, the government has to set the policies, but we monitor against those policies. And we make suggestions about the sorts of things the government might want to do to help us get to our net zero target. So we have a strong monitoring and sort of progress reporting element as well. Go to the next slide. How we're set up is we have a committee. We actually have two committees. We have a committee on mitigation that I sit on, and we have a committee on adaptation. The adaptation are the physical risks, physical impacts of climate change. Particularly for the UK, we have issues around flooding, for example, and coastal erosion. So how is the UK preparing for those? But I sit on the mitigation committee, and we're the committee that set the net zero target for the UK and really monitor how we're doing in terms of the emissions of greenhouse gases. So there's 8 of us on the committee. We have a very strong chair, Lord Stephen, who was a minister in government for many, many years. This is really helpful because he understands how government works and can really help to influence government and speak to government. Then there's me. I represent business. I've had a sort of 25-year career working in business all around climate change. So I bring a little bit of practicality to the committee in terms of what sorts of things businesses need to help to transition us. And then we have several climate scientists. We have to get climate science right here. We have to really think volumes of CO2 emissions to warming. So we have to really understand the basis of the act itself. And then we have some other professors and academics on energy systems, on economics, which is very key. And then we've also got Nick Chater, who is a professor of behavioural science, because we're seeing quite a lot of the way that we're going to get to net zero is around people's behaviours changing. So we've looked at the different pathways to get to net zero, and all of them involves people's lives changing. We're going to be changing the cars that we drive. We're going to be changing how we heat our houses. We also are seeing some dietary change as well. So how do people behave? How can we help people along this journey to net zero? So that's us in the committee, but people who do most of the work are our secretariat. This is about 30 really top-notch experts in a wide range of areas. We have specific subject-specific experts. On the left, you can see on power, industry, transport, buildings, and agriculture. We have a central sort of communications team because it's increasingly becoming very important for us to communicate this, particularly with the amount of interest which is being shown in the last couple of years. And then we also have an adaptation committee how we're looking at those impacts on our sort of physical environment, which I talked about. So this committee, the secretariat are funded each year by government. It's about 3.7 million UK pounds. So it's a substantial sum of money, but it means that they can really do the detailed analysis that's needed and also support a range of external advisory groups, which I'm going to mention later. So how do we work? So just going back, talking about that initial slide again, but talking here in a bit more detail. So we have a 5-yearly cycle where we set these carbon budgets saying, this is how much greenhouse gas emissions you can actually emit. But then, very important role for us really is in the monitoring of that. This is where we do these annual reports and we say how much greenhouse gas emissions have been emitted, and also more increasingly, what's the policies looking like that will bring those reductions in the picture as well. And that's becoming an increasing role for us as we're moving really away from setting the budgets to actually monitoring how we're doing things. actually struggling to hear a little bit. I don't know if everyone else can hear all that background. I hope not. And then finally, we produce lots of other reports alongside our statutory reporting, which is the annual reports and carbon budgets. We do what I would say are deep dives. So, for example, an area of interest for me in particular is land use. A couple of years ago, we did a really, really detailed study on the UK's land mass, on agriculture and on forestry, on food production, and how was this going to have to change to get us to net zero. And the detailed analysis in that report is then used when we're setting carbon budgets and when we're going forward looking at annual monitoring. So here's a little bit about some carbon budgets. So I keep talking about these 5-year budgets. If you look at this chart here, along the bottom we've got the years. So it starts with the pale green here. That was the Act when it was established in 2008. 5-year carbon budget there to 2012. So the year here is the middle of that budgeting period. And along the side we've got the emissions ROI axis. So we set these budgets 12 years in advance. So we've already had these 2 budgetary periods, so we can see the progress that's been made in meeting them. But we've just set, if I may say now, this last year in 2020, we've set the carbon budget for 12 years hence, which is this yellow budget here. And that's the budget for 2032 to 2037. So it has a middle year of 2035. And this 12-year report, 12-year advance warning lets business and industry and government really understand what's coming. So what do we need to be doing in 12 years' time? And this helps when you're planning finances for innovation programs, technology programs, house building programs. So having that 12 years is enough time that it gives planning time, but it's not too far in advance that perhaps we don't feel it's that relevant or important to us. So just going to summarise a little bit about the Climate Change Act. And I know Alina has also talked about this, but just summarising from a committee member's point of view, these really clear targets and most importantly, this transparent framework has really helped get business and public engagement because it's all there on our website for everybody to see. The legal obligation for Parliament has really focused minds within government on this. It's certainly more than just a nice to have. This is something that they have to deliver on. The 12 years ahead commitments, as I've talked about, give that good balance between having to act now, but also having little notice. And there's something I'd like to talk about in a bit more detail is our net zero target. So we've set net zero by 2050. When the Act was set up in 2008, it actually was set at an 80% reduction on 1990 levels by 2050. So that meant that there was 20% of greenhouse gas emissions which didn't have to change. And the problem with that was lots of different sectors thought that they might be in that 20%. And everybody thought they had a share of that 20% and didn't need to change. And so actually this net zero saying, you know, everything has to change, everyone has to act, has really focused some minds. And I think that's very much improved the focus we're seeing from business in particular on this. And as Alina has talked about, we've had several different political parties in government during the time the Act has been, and having this sort of independent voice on climate change has really helped resolve any political differences. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about our advice that we've given on the path to net zero. So we've recently, the government has recently set a target of net zero all greenhouse gases by 2050. So as I said, we originally had this 80% target, but after the Paris Agreement, the government came to us and said, is that target still relevant and appropriate within the Act? It says that we must take into account international circumstances. Is that still right? Can you go away and fix it again? And so we did. And we recommended to the government, and the government have accepted and legislated a target of net zero all greenhouse gases by 2050. If you look at this on a CO2 basis alone, the CO2 target would be in the early 2040s. But in the UK, the Act has always been set up for all greenhouse gases. And that's particularly important, I think, with respect to methane, which is very important to include. So I think setting that target was very important, that we looked at it in its entirety. So how did we as a committee recommend this to government? How did we do it? It wasn't a number just that came from thin air. It involved a great deal of analysis. And if I move to the next slide, the approach we take is actually defined within the Climate Change Act. So the Climate Change Act says you have to look at international circumstances. You have to look at the science. So you have to really understand what volume of greenhouse gas emissions gives you what volume of reporting. And that's why we've got some really world-class climate science. Then really importantly is you have to understand the budgetary impact of the recommendations on both the economy and on people. And I think that's really important. We're increasingly beginning to look at it as something we could just transition. So that's for everybody to be able to be part of this. And people not being disadvantaged, particularly in lower economic classes. Perhaps by not being able to change their cars over, by maybe costing more to heat their houses. It's really, really important to make sure that people aren't put into more poverty because of the Climate Change Act. So, as I said before, we looked at it on a sectorial basis. Power generation, and that's been a particularly successful UK in terms of decarbonising. We looked at buildings, which is quite a significant issue for us in the UK. We have a lot of old housing stock, which is very poorly insulated. We look at industrial emissions, transport emissions, and then agriculture and finally waste. And we also do a real bottom-up approach as well, a real world look at this. So what does this mean for our tax system? What does this mean for economics? What does it mean for security of supply? We wouldn't want the lights to go out. We do sort of our own food, less of our own food, for example. And we look at international policies as well, and air quality. And so we put all of that together to make our recommendation to government. And one thing we also looked at, we were aware of, was the historical emissions of the UK. So as the home of the Industrial Revolution, our historical emissions are the largest in the world. We're very aware of that. And also, we have a leadership role because we have a stable government. We have this Climate Change Act. So we felt that there was a role for the UK to go a little bit further as well. So that's what we do within the committee. But what's really, really important to get general acceptance and also to really understand that you're setting the appropriate targets is to do stakeholder engagement. And this is something I'm particularly involved with as a committee member. So when we set that target for government, we had an open call for evidence that, first of all, anyone could feed in their thoughts and comments. We then had 15 really detailed roundtables on different sectors, power, manufacturing, transport, etc. We had 400 meetings with individual stakeholders covering all sorts of different areas. So farmers union, lots of different sort of industry groups which we met. We then also commissioned some independent research projects on different pathways. So we spoke to our various universities in the UK. We went away and did different sort of deep dives and reports, which are all available on our website. And we use the information in those to help set the target. As a committee, we met frequently and often. We had 16 days talking about this. We meet one day a month. We did rather more whilst we were preparing this target. And we also had 3 other external advisory groups on areas which we thought were really important and we wanted extra information on. And that was on finance, on setting policies, and on health. So I would say most people active in climate change within the UK have been involved in this and do feel part of it and that they have had their input recognised. I just want to talk about one of the really real world things that we looked at in some detail. You have to look at asset lives. So you can't say, let's just all stop driving petrol cars now, because the average petrol car has a life of 14 years. And we're still selling brand new petrol cars now. So you have to look at those sorts of things when you're looking at different timelines. So you compare that 14-year life of a petrol car with, say, an aeroplane or a ship, which have a life of 30 years. So you can't just switch these things off. So you have to put all of those sort of asset lives when you're looking at these budgets. What is the fastest you can move? What's likely to be the most practical sort of solutions for these different areas? So we've looked at all of that as well. So a little bit about how we're going to get to 2050. So you can see these different colour wedges, and I'll just take you down them quite briefly. At the top, purple, we've got reduced demand for carbon intensive things and improved efficiency as well of how we're using our energy and our resources. And then the big wedge there, that big yellow wedge, is electrification. And we see in the UK electrification being a way of decarbonising many sectors. So we'll be driving cars which are electric, and we're already beginning to see that now. I've just bought my first electric car, which actually comes from Korea. We're also seeing electrification of our heating in houses, so and industrial processes as well. It's been quite straightforward decarbonising our electricity system. This doesn't affect individuals, so you're not having to go into people's houses. This is something that the public haven't really seen, and yet has been responsible for driving down our emissions. I think some of the other things we have to do now will be much more complicated and harder, but the decarbonisation of our electrification has been a success. We've come off coal in the UK. We're really focusing on offshore wind. We have some gas. The gas is there at the moment for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, but we're looking at gas coming off also in the mid-2030s, when we think that either it can be decarbonised or the carbon captured from that. We also see a role for hydrogen, and we see a role also for carbon capture and storage from some of our industrial processes as well. And then finally, at the bottom, you can see the green wedge, and that's some of the emissions which we just don't think we will be able to remove entirely. So predominantly aviation emissions. We don't want to stop people flying when they need to see family. It's quite important to have an aviation sector, and the aviation sector are doing a great deal to decarbonise, but the timelines of that are a little bit longer. We also see agricultural emissions as well, so particularly from ruminants. Those emissions are very hard to reduce. We want to support a farming sector in the UK, so how do you do that? And we see that there will be these emissions which have been reduced, which we need then to capture, and that can be through tree planting or through actually capturing carbon and storing it offshore. So that's our routes for getting there. And finally, this is where we are ending up. So just to show you our nationally determined contribution, which is here at 68%, 2030, and then by 2035 the emissions reductions of 78%. And I'm pleased to say this orange blob, the government have just actually accepted that recommendation in our SIP carbon budget. Our old target had been for 2050 to be 80%, so we've brought it forward by 15 years. I think this brings us to a slight sort of change of role for us as a committee. We've set these targets. I don't think there's a lot more target setting. We've set the target there in 2035. We know where we need to be in 2050. So for us, it's really now about monitoring progress and seeing that those policies are being brought forward to actually deliver this downward trajectory that we need. And we've changed a little in our annual reporting now to really deep dive on those policies. We now set it out in department by department, so that each government department can see really clearly the actions and policies needed within their department to deliver their part of net zero. So I'm going to go on to my very last slide now, which says, really important that all of this is transparent. So those annual progress reports to government are all transparent with sort of tick boxes saying how are they doing. It's all on the website. Please go and have a look at it. And here on the right, you can see we've also, in the run up to the United Nations conference in the UK, which we're hosting in Glasgow, we've also produced some briefing documents as well, which help explain a little bit in a summary form of what we do and how we do it. So I wish Korea and your committee all good wishes as you progress on this journey as well. Thank you.
중립위원회가 출범을 할 예정이어서 오늘 두 분 발표 말씀에 대해서 우리 토론자들께서 질문이 많이 있을 것 같습니다. 그래서 제가 얼핏 들었는데 10분 더 질문에 대한 답변 시간을 가질 수 있다고 했는데 가능한가요? 5시 10분까지? 네. Is it okay for you to spend 10 more minutes here? 답. 통역 답 없어요?
May I interrupt for a second? Dr. Averchenkova and Dr. Heaton, do you hear me well?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, so we were informed that you could spare 10 more minutes to answer the Q&A. Is that correct? Okay, thank you very much. We'll proceed.
됐어요? 두 분 다? 오케이. 예, 그래요. 그러면 지금 오늘 토론자는 총 6분인데 아마 6분이 다 솔직히 질문할 시간은 지금 없을 것 같아요. 현재 벌써 4시 55분이어서 15분밖에 남지 않았습니다. 그래서 이 질문은 꼭 해야 되겠다. 대한민국의 탄소중립위원회와 여러 각종 기후변화 관련 이 법안에 있어서 이 질문을 꼭 하고 해야 되겠다는 그런 것이 있으면 좀 질문을 해주시면 고맙겠습니다. 어느 분이 먼저 하시겠어요? 네, 질문. 네, 네, 마이크 해야 될 것 같아요.
예, 반갑습니다. 저는 그린피스의 정상훈 캠페이너고요. 서울 사무소에서 일하고 있습니다. 조금 전에 그 프레젠테이션 정말 잘 들었고요. 그리고 발표를 하시면서 간략하게 지금 영국의 비즈니스도 영국이 그러니까 이제 기업들이겠죠. 그 기업들도 산업계도 기후위기 대응에 적극적으로 나서고 있다라고 말씀을 해주셨는데 지금 한국 같은 경우에는 뭐 최근에 지금 토론이 열리는 장소가 정경련입니다. 정경련 같은 이제 기업 단체에서는 우리나라에서 뭐 탄소세 도입을 뭐 반대하는 취지의 그런 얘기도 하고 있고 좀 산업계와 컨센서스를 이루는 게 상당히 조금 하나의 과제이기도 합니다. 영국에서는 어떻게 이것을 조금 잘 해결을 하셨는지 그런 과정에 대해서 조금 궁금합니다.
네, 질문을 몇 개 받은 다음에 한꺼번에 답변하는 게 좋을 것 같아요. 그죠? 아무튼 답변이 길어질 수 있기 때문에. 그래서 지금 나온 질문은 한국 같은 경우
So the question was that Korea, it is very manufacturing intensive, taking up 27% of the total economy. Given that kind of a situation, I believe that it will be a little bit difficult to reach a consensus in terms of carbon neutrality. So I want to ask UK's advice on how to resolve that. The second question, I am Yoo-Soo Lee from the Korea Energy Economics Institute. I appreciate your presentation. I think my question might be similar, but it's slightly different. UK, when you set a target to respond to the climate change, and you mentioned that you're independent, you're neutral, and you're actually bridging the different interests of a lot of stakeholders. But to do so, I believe that there will be a lot of money involved to do so, and then there might be a budgeting issue. For example, in terms of Korea, in order to reduce GHG and to transition to, energy, many people are saying that we need to actually increase the rate for electricity. And we are thinking about how can citizens bear the burden of increased cost, the increased rate for electricity. So I want to understand if that has been the case in UK and how the citizens have reached a consensus, because we all understand what is great about responding to climate change, but then to actually pay more amount from your pocket might be a different story. So in terms of paying more, charging more for the same electricity, I want to know if there were any backfire from the citizens. Third question. I'm Dongjae from the Youth Climate Change Network. I have a question for Dr. Averchenkova. You've mentioned about the evidence-based policy making. I kind of understood it as it's kind of like a culture in the UK. And I kind of want to understand if what kind of policies or tools are in place to kind of ensure the independence of the CCC.
I am Kim Soo-hyung, and I have a simple question. We will soon launch the Korean Carbon Neutrality Commission in Korea, and when I listened to your presentations, the CCC is an advisory body, but it is somehow statutory mandating the government to review what it has proposed. So what I want to know is, well, in Korea, I think that the decision-making process is a little bit different from your place. So can you please tell us how the decision-making process is being implemented in the UK by reflecting the advices from the CCC? I also have a question.
소리 안 들리는데.
I also
예.
have a question. Yes, you can ask a question, but please make it very brief.
아, 저 질문해도 되나요? 네, 감사합니다.
Thank you. I have a question as well.
한동안 소리가 안 들려서 잘 몰랐습니다. 지금 제 배경이 보이실 텐데.
So I'm sure you can see my background. It is the onshore wind plant in Korea. So there's a wind turbine in a very, large space in the mountain. So although it's great, many people worry about in order to install the facilities to have some sort of renewable energy infrastructure, people are worried about isn't that also kind of ruining the nature? You have to cut down trees, you have to carve mountains. So that is causing a lot of conflict between a lot of like environmental NGOs and environmental activists. And I think that the same can be said for the UK. And if there is that kind of a conflict, I kind of want to know what the role is for the CCC to kind of narrow that kind of gap? Do you have like a public debate or some kind of system to iron out the details with the two parties? With that, we've asked 5 questions. So I've heard that the first question was not properly translated, so let me reiterate. So from the industrial side, when you set a carbon neutrality target, how do you reach a consensus from the industry side?
I'm happy to answer that. So it's very important not to offshore your emissions. We were very clear that we wanted to maintain that industrial output in the UK and for it to not just go overseas. So that's been very important. And I think the stakeholder engagement is really important in that. So working with the industry bodies. I think the industries have embraced this and are looking at the different ways to decarbonize. So predominantly through electrification of their power sources, but also through carbon capture and storage. Our universities are also doing quite a lot of work on this as well. And we're seeing collaborations between industry and universities. The government's also set up what we're calling a cluster approach. So different industries working together on this to solve some of these problems. And the government is giving support to these areas as well. Can I also, whilst I'm here, maybe just talk a little bit about the next question, which was around budgetary implications. So it's really important to understand that and to get that right. Obviously, there are significant costs involved. One example I'd like to give, though, was in 2008, when the Act was being prepared, we looked at a 60% reduction in carbon emissions. And we thought that would cost about 1 to 2% of GDP. The Act, in the end, came down at 80%, so a more significant carbon reduction. And it was still 1.1 to 2% of GDP. And now when we've just set a net zero target, so a more stringent target again, and we've done the economics, it's also about 1 to 2% of GDP. So these costs are coming down over time. We've shown that for some things it can actually be cheaper to decarbonise than not. So particularly the move from petrol cars to electric cars, it's actually cheaper to do that sooner and for people to drive electric cars. What we do though is we are very clear that this doesn't impact people's bills, and so we do produce every couple of years a report which we call the Prices and Bills report, and we look at all of the numbers and how it's impacting consumers. And the UK has been able to decarbonise its electricity supply really through government support. So the government have taken quite a long role in this, in giving companies 25-year contracts to produce low carbon electricity and making up that difference in cost. I don't know whether Alina wants to answer the next question. I think it was for you, Alina.
Sure. Thank you, Rebecca. So the next question was about evidence-based policymaking and how independence of climate change committee is ensured. And it is true in the UK there is very strong culture of evidence-based policymaking, but what we're also seeing, I think, in particular with the response to pandemics, I think the role of experts and their crucial importance in responding to crises such as COVID-19 or such as climate change, which is even more profound and long-term one, is very, very important. So in the UK, independence of the Committee on Climate Change is ensured in several ways. First, in terms of selection process, the selection of committee members is done through open calls for experts. It's a very public and transparent process. And very importantly, the members of the Committee on Climate Change are not selected based on their representation of any particular stakeholder group. So they are not, it's not a representation-based body. They're not representing, say, business, NGOs, or science. They are there in their personal capacity as experts with recognized expertise in a particular field that is deemed important for the UK climate change policy, be it climate science, be it economics of climate change, be it behavioral sciences, or as Rebecca has shown you, there is a wide range of expertise present on the committee. Of course, the committee members, they come from different sectors and their experience, like Rebecca has experience in the private sector and brings very valuable perspective in that sense. But the code of conduct of the committee members really states that they're not there to, in any sense, promote any political interest. The second way in which independence is ensured is for budgetary independence. So the Climate Change Committee has its own budget, over which they have full oversight, so they can decide how they spend those resources and what they focus, obviously within their core mandate. And there is also a detailed procedure for how a committee operates, ways to deal with conflict should that arise. But as far as I know, we've never had any issues with anyone raising any concerns with independence of any committee member so far. They've really been functioning really well. And maybe that's a good opportunity to comment on the next question. And if I can just, if you permit me, just share my screen very briefly, I'll show you a slide which I haven't included in my presentation, but it might just help clarify the question, which outlines the okay, well, I don't seem to be able to share a screen, but basically, in terms of mandates and responsibilities of different actors in the UK, the committee on the UK, the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, doesn't have the power to tell the government what to do. So I'd like to clarify that they're really independent advisor to the government. So they propose the level of carbon budgets. They conduct independent assessment of progress made, but the decisions on specific policies to be implemented on the level of carbon budgets are really taken by the government and the UK Parliament. So I think in that sense, I'm not sure it's really very different from how it works in other countries. So the government has responsibility. Okay, I seem to be able to share now. So in this slide, it really shows the key responsibilities and roles of each body in the process. So as I said, the CCC advises on emission reduction targets, on the long-term target, on the carbon budget. The government then considers that advice. They have to, as I said, publicly comment on whether they have taken on recommendations of the Climate Change Committee. And if some recommendations they didn't follow, they can decide not to follow them. What is important, they need to communicate why they haven't followed certain recommendations, which gives a different importance, high importance and transparency to the whole process and importance to the work of the CCC. And then it's the parliament which adopts the emission reduction targets, and then devolved administrations, they set their own targets and policies to contribute to national ones. So I hope that clarifies the role of each of the body in the decision-making process. And similar on policy planning, it's really the government which is in the driving seat. However, the Committee on Climate Change advises on policy options on mitigation and adaptation and comments on proposals that government puts forward for meeting carbon budgets. And then later on, as we discussed, assesses the progress in their implementation. Thank you so much.
If I can take the final question then, which was a bit about perhaps these trade-offs between environmental impacts, CO2, onshore wind. It's true there can be trade-offs. It's quite hard to, the change that's needed has implications, absolutely. I think how we overcome and get people on board really is through that stakeholder engagement, which I talked about. So really talking to a whole range of actors in all these different areas and getting all their views in. And that really helps us when we're suggesting to the government the different pathways which they can take to get to net zero. I think inevitably there are different views. The scale of change and the types of change which are needed is substantial. I think you won't get everybody agreeing with every single step along the way. But I think having that open debate and having an independent committee can really help some of those conversations as well.
이 기후변화 법안 또 위원회를
The
구성하는
Climate Change Act and how to have the Climate Change Committee. Well, we could hear that we need bipartisan support and bipartisan consensus to have the kind of enactment and the creation of the committee. Well, there can be differences in the belief on these measures. And my question is, what were some political or social or cultural background that made this kind of bipartisan consensus and support for this act and the committee?
I think it's actually always been quite straightforward. The different parties have always been quite aligned on this issue. I think when the Act was being set up, there's a lot of work done by the people who drove the Act to talk to all different parties and to get that support. So that support's been there right from the beginning. So I think there's also been quite a lot of public noise around this, so protests and debates, and I think the government are obviously very aware that there's strong feelings amongst the population about this as well. We also held a citizens' assembly, which wasn't something that the committee led, but the committee were involved with. And that was to really get people's views on climate change as well. So that helps inform the government on the direction that some of this is going, and I think can help them when they're deciding whether or not to accept our advice.
May I add to that, Rebecca? We've done some research looking at 2008. I fully agree with what Rebecca has just said, and I just wanted to add one additional factor. And back in 2008, for why different political parties, and in particular conservatives, which were campaigning for parliament, supported the idea of the Climate Change Act, was that the research has shown that young voters were placing a significant importance on environmental issues and particularly on climate change. And I know there are representatives of youth NGOs on this call today. So that was very important because the government understood, or the politicians understood that was an important issue. And secondly, also the pressure from environmental NGOs. There was a coalition of environmental NGOs in the UK, which has been putting quite strong pressure on different political parties to act on climate change. So I think these were additional factors and what has helped adoption of Climate Change Act.
감사합니다. 청년들의 역할이 중요하다. 너무 마음에
Thank
와닿고요.
you for your answer and your remark that the role of the young voters is important. That was really meaningful. We have this young gentleman here with us, and I really have great expectations for you. And I want to thank the two speakers for being with us despite being late on your next schedule. And we will take note of your great insights in creating this act and the committee in Korea. Thank you for your remarks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
예, 그러면 이제 45분 남아서 안 쉬겠습니다. 뭐 2시간짜리밖에 안 되니까 바로 그냥 진행하겠습니다. 이게 5분이
We
아까워요, 지금.
will not take a break, but go on to the panel discussion without a break. We have 6 panelists. 4 panelists are here with us, and 2 are joining us online. So the 4 panelists already asked questions. So I will give the floor to the 2 panelists. First, we have a senior researcher, Yoo-Soo Lee from Korea Energy Economics Institute. You have about 5 minutes.
안녕하세요. 말씀 잘 들었습니다. 감사합니다. 저는 사실
Thank you for giving me this chance to make a remarks. Well, I don't have any specific comment to the 2 presenters, but rather what I want to say is about my concerns.
국내 전력 산업의 여건하고
We
영국의
have to consider the situation of the Korean power market and the UK power market are so different. Actually, there are like 30 years of gap in terms of how it has evolved. So there are so much differences in our power system. So unless we revamp our power sector, it will be meaningless just to have this kind of act and committee. Just that will be meaningless. Actually, I want to show some graphs. Can I share my screen? So I will
직접
share
해주시면
my
됩니다.
screen.
네? 이 화면이 왜 이렇게?
예, 이게 제가 지금 이게 보이시나요?
So can you see my screen? Yes.
이게 지금 보이십니까? 지금 이제 영국이 지금
So if you look at the screen, then in case of the UK,
영국이 전력 부분이 사실 굉장히
it
중요한데요.
has this power sector that is playing a critical role in every sense. So in the power sector, as of last year, the UK has realized the carbon phase out. So power generation using coal is almost zero. And that means that when we have the carbon, the coal phase out in power sector, then all the other sectors can be liberalized. They can do a lot of things in other sectors, but that's not the case in Korea. What we have in Korea is just what the UK had about 30 years ago. So we have such a big gap. So it's very critical to have a big change and transformation in the power sector. So of course, it is great to have the committee and to have the act, But for it to be really effective, we have to first restructure the power sector. If you look at the proportion of different sectors, the UK has accomplished the coal phase out in the power sector. So its proportion is less than 20% in the emission, CO2 emission. Its big proportion is from the road and transportation as major emitter and resident. So those are just big emitters in the UK. But if you look at Korea, this is the power sector, including coal and the gas compound generation. So it means that we really need to have the power sector restructuring in parallel with this enactment for the act and the carbon neutrality committee to be effective. And our speaker, Dr. Averchenkova, has talked about this point that gas-fired power plants were introduced in the UK in 1990s. So the new technology and the market competition were introduced in 1990s, and that led to coal phase out acceleration. And so currently the UK has almost zero coal power generation. So that's the case of the UK, but in case of the Korean power sector, we are like 30 years behind that of the UK. So without doing anything about this and just touching on the governance of the carbon sector, that would not have any effect. Climate governance, of course, we need it, and we have many experts who will be paying attention to that. But for it to be effective, then we need to have restructuring in the power sector, and we need an independent body to oversee this. Currently, the government and the National Assembly regard the power as a welfare means, but that should be corrected, and we need to revamp the power sector. That's the end of my presentation.
Yes, to change our energy market, I believe the biggest hurdle, if you can pick one, what do you think it is? What is the biggest challenge? Is it the public servants? Is it the trade union? Is it KEPCO executive? Is it citizens? What is the biggest challenge here?
석광훈 박사님 음소거 해제해 주시기 바랍니다.
예, 죄송합니다, 교수님.
Sorry, Professor, I think you are still on mute. I guess it is because of, the business entities and the government, they're very closely tied. So are you saying that is it the Minister of Planning or, well, I believe that many of the public servants do believe that we need to restructure the energy market, but I believe like the National Assembly and the Ministry of Planning and Budget are the biggest hurdles. I think those two groups are the ones that are actually halting the transition. Thank you. Next, Dr. Yujin Lee. You are an expert. You're the Prime Minister's Green New Deal Special Advisor, Institution for Grand Transformation. So I'll give you 5 minutes. Thank you. Nice to meet you. We do have a basic act for green growth, and there's also a decree related to it. So it is a still legally binding target. Although it has a legal binding power, we were not able to comply with it. Why is that? I think we need to, look back at why that is and what can we do better. So in the administration of President Lee Myung-bak, it was BAU 30%, and in Park Geun-hye administration, it was BAU 37%. And then in 2019, we've changed it, so it's 24.4% compared to before. But last week, when we did the global summit on the green gas house emission, it moved from 2030 NDC from its previous 2050 net zero. So it actually brought the target forward. It was twofold for US, and Japan increased 26 to, I think, 46%. So the time has been brought forward. The target has been heightened. But Korea, we're just saying that we will try to start negotiating the NDC targets within this year. So why is that? It's because if you look at the second basic plan for climate change response, they say that we lack a control and coordination function. Second, it lacks systematic implementation, inspection, and monitoring. So what has happened is that we've set plans, but nobody's actually taking the charge. Nobody's leading it. There is no one that's spearheading these kind of efforts. And the second part, nobody monitors how it is implemented. Nobody's tracking the progress. Based on some of the keynote speakers, in case of UK, they come up with the interim 5-year carbon target and then they assess the progress that the government made. But nobody did that in Korea. I understand that we are impending the launch of the Carbon Neutrality Committee. So I want to know if the committee will take on that role. Will it be monitoring the progress? Will it be implementing and actually putting the policies into action? But again, we had something similar to Carbon Neutrality Committee, which was the Green Growth Committee. So then why didn't the Green Growth Committee work? Then can the Carbon Neutrality Committee do something that the Green Growth Committee failed? I think that is the important debate that we need to have. I think back in President Lee Myung-bak's administration, it did have certain authority, but I think moving on to President Park Geun-hye's administration, there wasn't even like a one offline meeting. It was more of just like reading documents and exchanging documents. So then for this CCCA in UK, they are independent, they are science-based, evidence-based, advisory board that actually gives a lot of suggestion to the parliament whether they take it or not. But in terms of Korea, the committee, they're not independent. They're directly under the president or under the National Assembly, which does not mean they're independent. I've met with a lot of stakeholders, and a lot from the private sector said that the climate policy and energy policy, it needs to have a certain conformity, but it lacks conformity. So we need to make sure that the two conforms. And 11.3% is from offshore. So they're saying that we need to take it into the onshore. So with all of this, we needed to change the roadmap from 2030, and we also wanted to bring a lot of offshore onto onshore. And we spent 3 years into meeting the 34 million ton. And we try to do that, but many are saying that Korea is not putting enough effort into meeting the NDC target. So we discuss based on the agenda that the government is putting forward, but that is not enough to show the IPCC or other related institution to say that this is an independent report and this is something that's going to be executable going forward. Therefore, CCC gives us a lot of learning. It needs to be independent. It has an independent budget, and they are responsible for whatever they publish, and everything is public and transparent. I believe those are very important key pillars. And if we are to launch a carbon neutrality committee, they also need to resemble something like these four factors. If not, then they will come up with a draft that the government will be willing to agree upon, and then we'll just work between those very fine lines. In the UK case, they said 78% versus the emission of 1990s. We can't go anywhere near that if we keep the practices that we were used to. The committee is planned to launch in May, and they're planning to have 77 private experts, and the total member of the committee will be somewhere between 50 to 100 people. I'm a little bit concerned because in June, the Ministry of Environment will come up with the NDC draft and several implementation plans, which will lead to a lot of conflicts, which will lead to a lot of debate. So I wonder if 100 member of the committee can actually coordinate and reach a consensus. I believe it will be very, very challenging. So when you are composing such committee, budget, independence, research capability, accountability, those are the must. In order to achieve that, it should not be government-led. Because if it's government-led, then all the private experts will be on a temporary basis. It will be on an ad hoc basis. So I believe that we need to move away from our previous practices. And given the current structure of the Carbon Neutrality Committee, it's not very different from the previous form of the Green Growth Committee. The coal phase out and fuel efficiency and all of those important discussion needs to be referred to the Carbon Neutrality Committee. And then we can further discuss who will be bearing the cost. Will the citizens be impacted with the increased rate? And I understand many time were spent in coordinating the differences between the Ministry of Industry, Energy and Transportation, and Ministry of Environment. So when this committee is launched, I believe that there might be some reformation required in the current ministry structure. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. And I could see that there are so much important messages that you wanted to deliver. We have still 4 panelists, and actually we have Congresswoman Lee Soyoung just arrived, and I will not have her welcoming remarks because that time is already passed, but we will now have the Carbon Neutrality Committee, and I believe that Congresswoman Lee Soyoung will play a critical role in our future path toward the carbon and climate action. So I just want to hear her commitment or ambition for the future in our carbon and climate actions. So you can come forward. So there were comments made already regarding the need for the restructuring of the power market in Korea for the Climate Change Act and the Climate Change Committee to be effective. Yes, I agree to that, and I can see that many people are joining us through YouTube. So about my ambition or goal, well, I want to first talk about my confession actually. Last year, after the general election, the Minju Party also stated the Green New Deal as the campaign promise. And the Green New Deal was adopted as a National Assembly task. And there was the declaration for the carbon neutrality by 2050. And I can see that there were many hopes for those declarations and commitments. So the declaration is made, but there should be following policies and decisions needed to implement the declaration. And I know that there are many concerns about that. And for the past 1 year, well, we can say that the past 1 year was the time for declaration, and the remaining 1 year of the current administration should be filled with executions and decision makings and actions to make the declaration a reality. And I will do my best to make that possible. Thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman Lee Soyoung. Now we will go on to the remaining panelists. So we will go the way backward. So please keep your 5 minutes of time.
Nice to meet you. I'm Kim Seho from the office of Congresswoman Soyoung Lee. I'm sure that a lot have been discussed. So I think what many people wonder is what is the progress of this Climate Change Act of Korea. So like Congresswoman Ms. Lee mentioned that the Green New Deal Act and Climate Act was one of the campaign from the presidential candidates. And we've been discussing a lot within the party, and they made a subdivision to kind of legislate the relevant law. I'm sure you all understand the background of why we need such law in place. And in the Lee Myung-bak administration, we had a Green Growth Committee, we had a Green Growth Act. And if we look at the progress that it made is that for some reason, we've emitted more GHG. There were more carbon emitted, and there were more sales of cars that had combustion engines that led to more GHG emission. Given the past track record, I believe that if we don't take any action, it might be very difficult for Korea to reach the carbon neutrality target. That's why we are trying to design a framework for the Climate Act, and such bill was proposed by Congresswoman Ms. Lee, and there were other series of relevant and related acts to the National Assembly. And even from our hotline, there was an immediate response to Climate Change Act, and there is also a Green Transitional Act for Sustainable Growth Act. So there are a series of these relevant acts. But we have to discuss what are the decrees related to this, because the act itself will not be enough unless we have some implementation tools such as the decrees. So that's where discussions are left. Initially, it might look like it's in a kind of a deadlock situation. But because of the 4 acts have been allocated to different ministries, and the person in charge are all divided. So it was quite difficult to bring everything together. And in May, we have another very big climate-related summit going on. So we are hoping to meet that deadline and come up with some kind of a framework related to the climate change. Many people said that super partisan or bipartisan are very important. So There are some disagreements that we have with the opposition party. They are reluctant to eliminate the word green growth in our Carbon Neutrality Act. So there are some details that we need to iron out. But once we've ironed out those details and go over some of the disagreements, I believe that we can reach a consensus. Dr. Yujin Lee also mentioned during her discussion, I think the Basic Act will be some kind of a combination of all of the four special acts that have been proposed to the National Assembly. And also, implementation is very important because there weren't any monitoring tools to see what kind of progress we're making. And because nobody was in charge, people were just kind of shifting responsibility, and that's why we have not been able to make so much progress, although we had the regulatory body and the related law. So we are trying to make the Carbon Neutrality Committee be in charge of monitoring the progress. So we want to have the virtuous cycle and an iterative cycle where the Carbon Neutrality Committee makes a proposal and then also monitor it and provide feedback back to the government. CCC said that it had an independent budgeting authority, but I guess in Korea, because the structure is different, it will be very difficult to do that. So with the launch of the Carbon Neutrality Committee, I believe in the beginning it will be the Ministry of MOIF that will be in charge, but I hope that later on we can make a different fund that the committee has a little bit more freedom in utilizing. I do think that CCC is the ideal model that we should target for. But I still wonder if we can actually make a decisioning based on the current structure. And the Green Growth Committee, if we look into the past, because it was an advisory to the government, they were only providing proposals or recommendations when they were prompted upon it. And that's very different from CCC. So in order to provide recommendations, provide advice, and then also provide feedback, I think we would also need to think about how to form a relationship with the government. Thank you.
Thank you for your insightful message. Now we will hear from member of the steering committee of BigWave, Dongjae. Well, I thought I will get 7 minutes, but I just get 5 minutes, so I will try to make it very short. So maybe reducing my message would be very hard, so I will just try to speak faster. I want to thank the host of this forum, and I understand that the role of the young people is very important, and also the role of the National Assembly is very critical to make that kind of transformation in the society. Since 2019, when we had the starting point for the formation of the committee, there has been a lot of movement from the youth sector of our society. And regarding the act, I want to first point out that the question is whether the National Assembly has the true commitment. The Minister for the Environment has a plan to build new airports, and at the general election last year, well, there weren't a lot of concerns about the environment or the climate, but the key topic of the campaign was regarding the residential issue. So the concern is whether this act and the implementation of the carbon neutrality would just be rhetoric and have no actual actions. And there are some additional things I want to talk about the 2030 goal, but I think that the other panelists can talk more details about this. But what I want to say is that we have the plan to enhance our NDC, but just setting the goal is not enough, but we have to have concrete actions. And I believe that the act should incorporate the enhanced NDC of Korea. And second, as Dr. Yujin has mentioned, we need an independent body to oversee the progress. So Dr. Yujin has just talked about the very details of the issue, but I'm just pointing out that we need to pay attention to this. So a strong and professional body of experts is needed. So just as in the case of the CCC, it has the evidence-based culture for this committee, and it is making an independent research and independent advice possible. And that is how the parliament is reviewing the advices from CCC as a meaningful outcome of the study. So there are some lessons that we can take from CCC. So we have to think about our situation, whether we also have those independent and science-based studies. So it's not an evidence-based decision-making, but policy making the evidence. So I think that what we did in Korea was just the media play. So we were just trying to showcase or talk about those big words and not put them into action. So we could see that there were no concrete reports. I also talked with some public research institute officials, and I asked whether they have performed some of those independent studies, but they said that it is not to be opened up to the public. So in Korea, we have a lot of hot keywords that are touted in the media, but we do not know whether the trustworthiness of those words. So to accomplish the 2050 carbon neutrality, we have to think about the reliability of those words and those measures and actions. Third point I want to make is that during the decision-making process, we need to have the young people getting involved. What was very insightful from the CCC's case was that the members of the committee had independence guaranteed. So there were open discussion between those members and the other parties involved. And that was possible because the decision-making was made separately from the reviews and the studies of the committee. But what is the situation in Korea? Well, when we had a similar study in Korea 5 years ago, many of the members of the study were those who were involved with the power plants, major power plants. So when we introduce the new act in the committee, we should make sure that we have no such problem in the future.
So if the current structure in which experts are provided by the ministries and public institutions that are bound to naturally represent the interest of a specific fossil fuel industry continues, I don't believe that we can make any changes. So can we at least involve young people independent of all kinds of interests in the discussion process? Most young people are students or beginners in society and are able to debate and produce results without being caught up in any industry or any certain interest. If that's also difficult, couldn't we just accept the interest of being a young person who will live most of his life and miss the reality of the climate crisis and feeling anxious about tomorrow? I don't think it's an unreasonable demand. I've mentioned these three, and I believe that these should be reflected, and I also want the law to be enacted as fast as possible. Thank you. Dongjae, member of the steering committee, BigWave Youth Climate Change Network. Thank you. I can feel how passionate you are as a youth. And they're saying that the newly built airport, it's going to be built in Busan, are saying they're going to be carbon neutral airport. I'm not sure if that is feasible or not, but we can say one thing for sure. It lacks consistency. There is somebody saying one thing and there's another person saying another. I believe that youth and citizens are quite dumbfounded, and it's very confusing. Next, we will have Yoo-Soo Lee, the senior researcher from Korea Energy Economics and Institute. Today, I've heard a lot of great things in the presentation, and I just want to say one thing. I'm really, really jealous. I'm very envious of the UK situation. It has a really great system. I believe in Korea, there is going to be a carbon neutrality committee that will be launched, and if we really think about it, it's not because we didn't have a committee. It's not because there was an absence in law. We did have a committee. We did have a certain legislation. But despite all of that, it really didn't implement, or it didn't really make a difference. And I know that there are a lot of underlying reasons why that is. It may be because the policies were not implemented because people don't know how to implement it or who should be implementing the policy. Nobody was actually checking on the progress. Nobody was monitoring it. And there weren't a thorough planning of how to progress with the policies. So I believe that there's a lot of room for improvement. So when the committee actually launches, I hope that we can take some of the lessons from the UK, and if we can reflect them as much as possible, I believe that it will be a more efficient and effective committee. I also want to say that in order to achieve the carbon neutrality target, first is to have a implementation framework. To do so, we need to transform the energy system, because if not, even though we have the world's best governance system, it will not actually work. And I'm quite skeptical that we will reach or deliver our target. To talk about the market structure, it's something that we've talked about for years, and it was pretty much a very public-led or governmental-led market. That's why the market is very rigid. And I think the number one priority was to stabilize the security of demand and supply of energy. And because we put too much focus on a very secure supply of energy, I think all of the rest just fell through the cracks. And people thought that, well, we achieved number one priority, so we can lay back a little bit for all the other factors. And of course, the security of energy supply is very important, but I just believe that we are putting too much emphasis on it, and it's creating the other important factors to suffer. I think there are two preliminary conditions that we need to do. One is to expand renewable energy, and two is to really reform the market. And I think our too much emphasis on security of energy supply is becoming a hurdle. I also want to mention about the very restricted competition in the energy market, because there are very strict regulation in any market entry, any power company to enter the market. I believe the competition is very much limited, and that is actually limiting the entrance of renewable energy. I do believe we have a very long way to go. We also have to talk about the pricing system. The wholesale and the retail market, because of its price tariff that is structured right now, it is really kind of hindering the entrance of renewable energy. As you know, last year, the demand energy tariff system didn't really work. Even from that, we can understand that for the carbon neutrality to work, all of these factors in the market need to properly perform. To do so, the cost signal is a must in order to make sure that we are producing as much as needed and consumed as produced. Even in the electricity market, we do have an electricity committee, but it's not playing any role per se. The reason for that is because the market is very heavily regulated. If it was a freely competing market, then the Committee of the Electricity sector would have played its role because the market is kind of operated based on all the regulation, there's really not much that the committee can do. Therefore, we need to make sure that the market recovers its function as a competitive fair market, and then the committee will have a role to play in terms of monitoring, regulating, and advising. We've continued to have a public-led or government-led market, but without the private investment, it will be very difficult. In order to diversify our energy source, investment is required, and that will play a very important role in transitioning the energy. We're also talking a lot about sector coupling. And to do that, there is a need for division of energy producers and consumers, but that is also disappearing. And abolished the strict division between sectors is something that's very important in terms of the discussion of sector coupling. And there is an active discussion on sector coupling for stabilization of the power system due to supply-demand imbalances in the power sector. And regulations on clear division of business areas have also been removed. So I believe that the market itself is pretty much fragmented into parts where market players can intervene and where it cannot. And the areas that it cannot is pretty much ran by the regulation. Therefore, in order to move to a different type of market, we will need to reach the public consensus because it requires a lot of cost. And that cost is inevitably going to be shifted to the citizens. But before the citizens are fully on board about what to do, why this is important, it will be very difficult to reach a consensus by just burdening them with more bills to pay. So we need to persuade the citizens. We will need to have like an open debate to have all the citizens on board. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. And you also talked about coupling the fuel prices, but actually it should be working both ways. But we can see that this system is only taking effect when the global oil price is dropping. So for researchers and experts, we feel very pessimistic about this mechanism. And last panelist is from Greenpeace. We have a campaigner, Sanghoon, to make the comment. Nice to meet you. I am Sanghoon from Greenpeace. So thank you for all the great presentations and comments. So when I listened to the case of the UK, I had a lot of thoughts because there were great examples of the UK where it reviewed the system and the progress every 5 minutes and set the goals every 5 minutes, and that was very meaningful. However, it still has the homework left, and that is to how to adjust the 2030 goal. We're creating our new commission to accomplish the carbon neutrality. And to do that, we have to reduce the carbon emission by half by 2030 and to eliminate it 100% by 2050. So as Dr. Lee has said, the US said that it will cut its emission by twofold. The emission reduction will be increased by twofold by 2030. So actually what we need to talk about is not about 2050 goal, but rather about 2030 goal. And in 2018, in Incheon, Songdo, we had a special UN IPCC report, and it said that we still have about 420 billion ton of carbon budget left, but it is being consumed very fast. So if we just roughly calculate it, we just have about 7 years left. And with that, timeline and to accomplish the carbon neutrality by 2050, well, you can do the calculation and you can see what's the implication of that. So at the National Assembly, there are many laws to be adopted regarding the climate change, and that really should incorporate all the demand from the global society regarding the carbon neutrality. And regarding the CCC of the UK, all the other panelists have talked about this already, but CCC is significant because it's an independent and professional body of advisory. So we need to have a similar system in Korea. And delegating those mandates should be also mentioned in the newly enacted act to really give the power to the committee. So we are having this forum at Federation of Industries of Korea here, and we also had some debates about the introduction of the carbon tax, and in the media, it covered that the Federation of Korean Industries is against the introduction of the carbon tax. And in EU and in Japan, many companies are even asking for the hike of the carbon tax. And before the Leader Summit on Climate hosted by the US, many companies of the US have demanded the increase of NDC on their own part. So they are saying that if they don't do it, then the market mechanism would collapse. And that's why they are taking the lead in demanding that kind of increase in NDC and all the other climate goals. But that's not the case in Korea. That's quite regrettable. And even if companies are not taking the lead, I believe that the government should take the leadership to form a consensus with the society and the businesses. So of course, this is not easy, and the 2030 goal is even more ambitious than the 2050 goal. So if we say that we currently have an early cancer, then that's the situation we have right now. But what we need to do is, even though it's painful, we have to take the surgery to cut out that cancer, that tumor. So in that sense, I think that the new act to be introduced is very important, and we have to form a consensus in our society. I don't have a lot of time, so I will just wrap up my message here.
Thank you. You talked about FKI, the Federation of Korean Industries, but the emission trading system was introduced in 2012. The original plan was introduced in 2009. It was delayed, postponed to 2012, and then it was delayed again. So I think there were a lot of industries that were highly, strongly opposed, and one of the representative group was FKI, and that was because if that was introduced, then all the companies would have to pay 20 trillion won as a fine, and then all the Korean companies will go belly up. I wonder if the emission trading system was not introduced, then in this era where we're paying carbon tax, then I don't believe the Korean companies would have survived in this era. I think because we did introduce the emission trading system, the Korean companies were able to have a better recognition and awareness about the climate change. So right now, when there's any backfire, I kind of wonder if they are understanding the situation or not. We heard about the UK case. It gave us an opportunity to look back and where Korea is at. I believe that we shouldn't be nervous, but we also have to be aware that we don't have that much time. So for everyone, every actor who has an interest and who has an advocate at heart for this climate change, I hope that we can take actions. I hope the politicians understand the urgency of this issue and take action so that Korea can also be a contributor in mitigating and adapting the climate change. I think that is our duty as a global citizen. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.